The longest and most hopeless conflict of our time, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, goes back to the distant past of the times of Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, King Herod, Emperor Titus and Sultan Saladin. But for a general idea of what the Jews did not share with the Arabs, and why Israel is not destined to live peacefully, a quick glance at the history of the last century is enough. A brief chronology of key events in the endless Palestinian-Israeli conflict is given below. But first, a few words about the important thing, about the mythology of the land for which Jews and Arabs have been fighting for decades. Promised Land. A small stretch of desert territory on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea is considered more than just home by Jews, Christians and Muslims. They consider it Holy Land. The navel of the Holy Land is Jerusalem. According to Jewish tradition, God began the universe from here. The Jews had a temple here, but the first was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the second by the Romans. Only the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, now the main Jewish shrine, survived. According to Christian tradition, Christ was crucified in Jerusalem and from here he ascended to heaven. Here stands the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the main Christian shrine. According to Muslim tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended from here to meet Allah. The location of this event is the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in central Jerusalem. Now it is listed as the third most important Muslim shrine after Mecca and Medina. Myth and religion partly explain support for Palestinians in the Arab world and Israelis in the West. But they are just a canvas on which the chronology of the most protracted and hopeless confrontation in modern human history is written in blood. Here it is. Ottoman Palestine and the First Aliyahs. By the end of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century, Palestine had already been a territory, not a state, populated predominantly by Arabs for several centuries. Most professed Islam, some Christianity. Jews professed Judaism and were a minority. But all of them, both Arabs and Jews, were considered Palestinians. At the turn of the century, Jews from foreign countries began to buy land and move to Palestine. Anti-Semitism in Western Europe and the Russian Empire, Jewish pogroms, wars and revolutions, poverty and, of course, the dream of a Jewish state spurred the desire to return to the Promised Land. Several waves of Jewish immigration, Aliyah, dissolved the local Jewish population of Palestine, with whom the Arabs had normal relations. There was friction, then unrest, and then blood was shed. The Arabs did not like the fact that the newly arrived Jews treated them like the colonialists treated the Aborigines. They were disgusted by the dissolute character of the Europeanized repatriates by their standards, but most of all by their tendency to isolate themselves and create a new way of life, new settlements and a new reality, rather than integrate into the existing one. The specter of a Jewish state was already looming on the horizon in lands that the Arabs had considered theirs for centuries. The Jews also considered them theirs, since they lived here for thousands of years. Palestine was in such an explosive state when the Ottoman Empire collapsed as a result of the First World War. At that time, 500,000 Muslims lived in Palestine. Christians and Jews were in the minority, about 60,000 each, and among the Jews, 3/4 were still natives, and only about 15,000 were immigrants. However, the situation changed very quickly. 1917 to 1922. Balfour and the British Mandate. The Ottoman Empire entered World War I on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary and lost. The Middle East was divided between the winners, Britain and France. Their former ally Russia withdrew into the abyss of the revolution on November 7, 1917. A few days before the Bolshevik riot in St. Petersburg, which determined the fate of Europe for decades to come, another epoch-making event occurred in London that changed the fate of the Middle East. British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote to inform British Zionist leader Lord Rothschild that His Majesty's government looks favorably on the restoration of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine and will make every effort to ensure that this goal is achieved. 3 years later, Great Britain received a mandate to govern Palestine from the League of Nations. The Balfour Declaration is repeated almost verbatim. As a result of the division of spheres of influence in the post-Ottoman Middle East, Syria and Lebanon went to the French, Palestine and Mesopotamia to the British. Transjordan was also transferred to British custody a little later, but the promises to the Zionists enshrined in the Balfour Declaration did not apply to it. The British were unable to reconcile the Arabs and the Jews. Their obvious favor towards immigrants from Europe who were similar in spirit and culture only convinced the indigenous Arab majority that the British Empire was not suitable for the role of an impartial organizer of the future independence of Palestine. The situation worsened with the growing number of repatriates. Jews fled Europe en masse to escape Nazism. By 1947, the UN Commission counted more than 600,000 Jews among 1.2 million Arabs in Palestine. 30 years earlier, the Arab population was almost 10 times larger than the Jewish population, but now it is only twice as large. 1947 to 1949. Partition of the United Nations, the First War, Catastrophe, and Independence. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution dividing Palestine into two independent states, Jewish and Arab. Jerusalem, including Bethlehem, was given special status as a territory under UN control. Nobody liked the resolution, and literally the next day clashes began. The British mandate expired on the 14th of May 1948. On the same day, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the creation of an independent Jewish state. And the next day the Arab states attacked Israel. They lost. Israel, barely educated and not yet aware of borders, was victorious. 1967. Six-Day War, Refugees and Settlements. At the end of May 1967, Arab countries massed troops to the borders of Israel and began vying to threaten to wipe out the Jewish state from the face of the earth. Israel launched a preemptive strike, and after 6 days it was all over. The Gaza Strip, the West Bank and eastern Jerusalem were under Israeli occupation. At the same time, Israel occupied the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. From that moment on, the conflict became permanent. The Arabs finally emerged as mortal enemies of the Jewish state. And their hopes for the creation of a Palestinian Arab state have receded into a dim future. Residents of the West Bank and Gaza who fled the war were never able to return home. Israel sees them as a threat to complete Arabization and destruction of the country. There are now about 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, almost 3 million in the West Bank. And more than 6 million Palestinian refugees have settled abroad, mainly in neighboring countries of the region, according to UN data. For comparison, the entire population of Israel is approaching 10 million people, of which 2 million are Arabs. At the same time, Israel began to populate the occupied territories. According to the UN, there are already more than 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem. There are small settlements in the Golan Heights, but there are none in Gaza. Israel took everyone out in 2005 and fenced off with a huge fence. The international community considers the settlements illegal, but Israel insists it is within its rights. The problems of refugees and settlements are at the heart of any settlement negotiations, even before they come to the main questions about the status of Jerusalem and the creation of an Arab Palestine. 1979 to 1993. A new war, recognition of Israel and peace negotiations. Negotiations for peace with neighboring Arab countries and a settlement with the Palestinians have been held with varying failure over the past half-century. Formally, Russia and the European Union are involved in them, but the main mediator has always been the United States, a key ally and guarantor of Israel's security. Through the mediation of President Jimmy Carter, Israel signed the first peace treaty with Egypt at Camp David in 1979. It was preceded by the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Egypt and Syria tried to recapture the territories lost in 1967. As a result of the treaty with Egypt, the first non-disputed border of the Jewish state appeared on the map. The only next one, with Jordan, was formalized in 1994. There are still no agreements with Lebanon and Syria. And a year before that, in 1993 in Oslo, Through the mediation of another American president, Bill Clinton, the first document was signed between the Israelis and Palestinians. The Norwegian agreements ultimately turned out to be a failure. Direct attempts to resolve the conflict stopped 10 years ago. 2007 to 2023. Wars with Hamas and peace with neighbors. Since it was not possible to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, the United States switched to negotiations between Israel and neighboring Arab countries. Under Donald Trump, Israel normalized relations first with the UAE and then with Bahrain and Sudan. Joe Biden hoped to reconcile Israel with Saudi Arabia. In the fall of 2023, Hamas attacked Israel and a new war began. Since 1987, Israel has experienced two Palestinian intifadas lasting more than a decade. Both began under the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization and Yasser Arafat. At the end of the Second Intifada in 2005, after the death of Arafat, the Palestinians began to fight among themselves. The radical Islamist group Hamas, recognized as terrorist in many countries around the world, has recaptured the Gaza Strip from the more moderate Fatah. The West Bank remained under Fatah's control, and Israel has been at war with Hamas ever since. In 2007, the Israelis imposed a complete blockade of Gaza and carried out military operations there several times: 22 days in 2008, 8 days in 2012, 1.5 months in 2014, and 11 days in 2021. The current war began on October 7, 2023, exactly 50 years after the attack on Israel on the main Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur, Judgment Day. Every day this war increases the number of victims of the longest conflict of our time and delays the prospects for peace in the Middle East.